Sometimes, the people we underestimate the most carry the power to change everything. This is the story of a woman who thought she was entitled to someone else's seat, only to discover that the man she looked down upon owned far more than she could ever imagine. At the international airport, the air buzzed with the usual chaos of departure gates, families juggling luggage, business travelers tapping on laptops, children tugging at tired parents. Amid the rush, a white woman entered the terminal with an air of superiority, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as though the space itself was her stage. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and almost instantly she frowned at the sight of the long boarding line. With a sharp sigh, she rolled her eyes at the attendants behind the counter, treating them like servants who weren't moving fast enough. She clutched her designer bag close, tapping her foot impatiently, muttering loud enough for those nearby to hear about how she hated waiting in lines meant for ordinary people. Just a few steps away, a tall, well-dressed black man stood calmly, his demeanor the opposite of hers. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his posture straight, his expression relaxed. He wasn't glued to his phone or complaining about the wait. He simply observed the flow of people around him, hands loosely folded, exuding a quiet strength that didn't demand attention. Yet, to the woman, his composure was invisible. She glanced at him briefly, her gaze dismissive, her mind instantly, labeling him as someone of less importance simply because he wasn't loudly announcing who he was or what he had. In her world, silence equated to insignificance. When the gate attendants finally announced boarding, the woman surged forward without hesitation, slipping past several rows of waiting passengers. She waved her boarding pass like a golden ticket and barked about her need for priority boarding. The attendant, trying to remain polite, reminded her to wait her turn, but she scoffed, lifting her chin. "Do you know who I am?" she said sharply, the words dripping with arrogance. The people in line exchanged uneasy glances, but no one challenged her. The black man remained exactly where he was, calm and unbothered, moving only when his group was called. As he approached the gate, he handed his pass to the attendant. The scanner beeped approvingly, granting him access to first class. Before he could step forward, the woman spotted the seat number printed on his pass. Her eyes narrowed in disbelief, and then she let out a short, mocking laugh. "That can't be right," she sneered loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "First class? Him? Are you sure your machine isn't broken?" The attendant stiffened, but before they could respond, the woman pressed on, her voice rising. She insisted there must be a mistake, that the seat he was assigned had to be given to someone like her, someone who deserved it. The man turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with calm eyes, but he said nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't even frown. His silence seemed to irritate her even more, as if his refusal to fight back robbed her of the satisfaction she sought. Passengers around them began shifting uncomfortably, some looking away, others shaking their heads. Still, the woman was relentless. She jabbed her finger toward the attendant, demanding that they fix this error. She claimed she had higher status, that she needed the best seat because she was used to certain standards. Her words rang out with entitlement, as if the entire boarding gate existed only to cater to her whims. The man, unshaken, allowed her rant to continue without interruption. He stepped slightly aside, giving her space, his composure steady as ever. His calmness created a mirror that only made her anger look louder, harsher, and more ridiculous in contrast. When she realized no one was moving quickly enough to satisfy her, she made the boldest move of all, storming down the jet bridge and sliding directly into his assigned seat. She sank into the plush leather chair with a satisfied smirk, crossing her legs as though she had conquered a battle. "This feels more like it," she said smugly, pulling her bag onto her lap. "He can sit somewhere else." The flight attendants rushed to intervene, their faces tight with embarrassment. They whispered apologies to the man, explaining that they would handle the situation. But instead of arguing or demanding his right to the seat, he simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He remained dignified, never raising his tone, never retaliating against the humiliation unfolding before him. To him, the seat was just a chair, a momentary place on a journey. To her, it was proof of power, something to cling to at any cost. The attendants scrambled to find temporary arrangements. The tension thickened. Passengers whispered among themselves, some openly glaring at the woman for her arrogance. Yet she sat tall and unbothered, convinced she had won. She interpreted his silence as weakness, his patience as proof that she had bested him. But the audience watching, both the people on that flight and those hearing the story unfold, could see the deeper truth. She had taken a seat, yes, but he had held on to something far greater, his dignity. And in that contrast, the woman's loud entitlement versus the man's quiet humility, the real clash began. Once inside the plane, the woman settled deeper, into the stolen first-class seat as if it were a throne, her posture sharp with triumph. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her jewelry, and made a show of settling in, determined that everyone around her would notice. Leaning toward the passenger, beside her, she began to brag, her voice carrying loudly through the cabin. She spoke of her supposed connections, politicians, executives, wealthy friends. Each story grander than the last, each detail sharpened to paint her as someone untouchable. She laughed too loudly, gesturing with her hands, ensuring no one could ignore her. When her gaze flicked toward the man standing calmly a few rows away, she smirked, tilting her chin upward in mock pity. "Some people just don't belong in places like this," she said with a chuckle, her words sharpened to cut. "Imagine trying to sit up here when you probably can't even afford it." Her laughter spilled into the air, and though no one laughed with her, she carried on as though the cabin itself agreed. The man, meanwhile, accepted a glass of water from a passing attendant and took his seat quietly nearby. He didn't glare, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge her insult. He simply sipped his water, his eyes steady, his posture composed. That calmness seemed to unsettle her in a way anger never could. His silence created an emptiness she desperately wanted to fill with her own noise, so she grew louder. She commented on how the staff should pay her more attention, how the champagne wasn't chilled enough, how the pillows were not to her standard. Each complaint was punctuated by glances at the man, as though daring him to respond. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying disapproval. Some leaned away from her theatrics, some exchanged glances of irritation, but she either didn't notice or didn't care. She carried herself as though their discomfort was beneath her, as though her entitlement outweighed their right to peace. A couple across the aisle whispered to each other, clearly embarrassed for the man she continued to mock. Yet he remained, still letting the storm pass over him, unbothered by her attempts to draw him into conflict. The attendants, however, noticed everything. They approached him discreetly, their words polite but edged with apology. One leaned close and whispered softly, thanking him for his patience. Another addressed him with a respectful tone, asking if there was anything specific he needed, making sure he was comfortable despite the situation. These gestures were subtle, but unmistakable. The staff treated him with deference, the kind reserved for someone who held significance beyond that of an ordinary passenger. He responded each time with a nod, never demanding, never pushing, his politeness steady. The woman, of course, dismissed it all. She laughed when she noticed the attendant speaking to him, waving her hand as though to shoo away the idea that he could be anyone important. "They're just being nice," she told those nearby, her voice coated in smugness. "People like that need to feel special somehow." She chuckled again, her tone laced with arrogance. "Trust me, if he were actually somebody, we'd all know it by now." The flight pressed on under a quiet strain. Passengers attempted to focus on their meals or entertainment, but the woman's voice cut through everything. She complained about the food, demanding to know why it wasn't cooked to her liking. She snapped at an attendant over the wine selection, rolling her eyes when they apologized. She sighed dramatically at the temperature of the cabin, muttering about how standards had dropped, and every so often her gaze returned to the man, as if daring him to react. Yet he never did. His composure stood in stark contrast to her tantrums, his silence becoming a shield that made her own voice sound more shrill with each passing minute. What she failed to notice were the patterns forming around her, the way attendants leaned toward him with subtle bows of respect, the way they double-checked small details with him, whether the cabin was comfortable, whether service was running smoothly, gestures invisible to most, but deliberate in their meaning. These were not random courtesies. They were acknowledgments, signs, clues to his true identity. Yet, blinded by arrogance, she dismissed everyone. The unease in the cabin grew. Passengers glanced at the man with curiosity, sensing there was more to him than he revealed. They whispered quietly, observing the contrast between his quiet dignity and her loud entitlement. The tension had shifted. It was no longer just about her stealing a seat. It had become about something larger, something unspoken, something waiting to be revealed. And still she remained oblivious. Reclining smugly, sipping her drink, she basked in what she believed was victory. She thought his silence meant defeat, that his calmness meant weakness. But to everyone else watching, his silence was strength, his composure a warning of something far greater than she could imagine. By the time the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of the engines filled the silence between her complaints, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The passengers felt it. The attendants knew it. The man embodied it. A reveal was coming, something that would turn her smug laughter into stunned silence. But, for now, she remained blind, lost in her arrogance, while the truth sat quietly beside her, waiting for the right moment to speak. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm, the hum of the engines filling the air as meals were cleared away, and passengers began to relax. Some flipped through magazines, others closed their eyes against the dimmed cabin lights, and a few whispered quietly to one another. It was in this lull, when everything seemed calm, that the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through steady and composed. He welcomed the passengers once more, and then added a detail that stirred the entire cabin. On this flight, he announced, was the executive owner of the airline, traveling discreetly among them. At once, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers rippled through the rows like a wave, passengers craning their necks, eyes darting from face to face wondering who it could be. The air carried a low hum of curiosity, the kind that grows when everyone realizes something extraordinary is unfolding in an ordinary moment. The attendants began to move with more precision, their gestures deliberate and respectful. They adjusted their uniforms, straightened trays, and prepared themselves as though they were about to greet royalty. Subtle smiles flickered across their faces, and their tone softened as they spoke among themselves. It was clear this was not just routine. It was reverence. Their movement signaled that whoever this person was, they held the deepest respect of those who worked closest with them. The woman, who had spent the entire journey flaunting herself in the stolen seat, gave a sharp laugh that cut through the whispers. She leaned back smugly, twirling her glass between her fingers, and muttered loudly enough for several passengers to hear. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Important people don't fly with common passengers. If the owner of an airline were here, they'd have their own private jet, not sit among us." She adjusted her necklace, smirked, and added with exaggerated pride. "Now me, on the other hand, I move in those circles. I know people like that." Her words carried arrogance, but no one around her nodded or laughed. Instead, passengers looked past her, eyes searching for the person who truly deserved attention. The whispers grew more focused now, and attendants began aligning themselves toward one section of the cabin. The lead attendant walked forward with careful steps, pausing near the man who had been quiet through every insult and humiliation. Her expression was one of warmth and professionalism blended with unmistakable respect. With a graceful incline of her head, she addressed him formally, thanking him sincerely for choosing to fly on his own airline. The words landed in the cabin, like a thunderclap. For a moment, silence hung heavy, and then realization swept through the passengers like electricity. The man who had been mocked, dismissed, and belittled was not just another traveler, he was the very owner of the airline itself. The woman froze where she sat. Her smirk dissolved, her mouth parted, but no sound emerged. Her eyes darted from the attendant to the man and then to the faces of the passengers who were now smiling knowingly, some nodding with respect toward him. Her skin flushed, her posture stiffened, and she suddenly seemed much smaller in the very seat she had stolen. In one cruel twist of fate, the arrogance she had wielded so confidently had shattered. Every boast, every insult, every dismissive laugh echoed back to her with crushing weight. Passengers began to lean forward, some extending hands to him with genuine gratitude. They thanked him for keeping such high standards, for the way his airline treated them, for the comfort and safety of their travels. A few applauded softly, the sound spreading in waves until it filled the cabin with a quiet chorus of appreciation. The man accepted their gestures with grace, nodding politely, his expression calm and humble, never drawing attention to himself, never basking in the recognition. His humility, even now when the truth had been laid bare, stood in sharp contrast to the woman's frantic unraveling. Desperate to salvage her pride, she leaned forward, laughing nervously as though the entire ordeal had been some sort of joke. "Well, I had no idea," she stammered. "I mean, what a coincidence. I was only teasing, of course." She reached for charm she didn't have, speaking with a voice suddenly sweet, her eyes wide as she tried to win him over. "I'm sure. You understand how these things happen. Misunderstandings, you know? Perhaps I could buy you a drink when we land." But her words, once laced with arrogance, now dripped with desperation. The passengers who had witnessed her behavior did not believe her excuses. Their eyes held judgment she could not escape. The man did not ridicule her, nor did he offer her the dignity of pretending to accept her apology. He simply met her gaze for a brief moment, his expression calm, his silence louder than any rebuke. Then, with the same quiet composure he had carried from the start, he returned his attention to those around him, thanking the passengers who extended their hands, nodding gently to the staff who continued to honor him. His refusal to scold or mock her was, in itself, a form of judgment. It was grace delivered without words, a lesson far more powerful than anger. The woman sank back into her seat, her hands fidgeting nervously with the edges of her scarf. Her earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing realization that everyone had seen her for who she truly was. She had fought so hard to prove her importance, only to humiliate herself before the one person whose approval she could never force. The cabin, once filled with her voice, now pulsed with admiration for him, and in that contrast her defeat was complete. When the wheels touched down and the plane rolled smoothly across the runway, there was a sense that the journey had been more than just miles traveled through the air. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, whispers lingered about the revelation that had turned the flight into a story none of them would forget. At the gate, the scene waiting was unlike any ordinary arrival. A line of staff and executives had assembled, standing tall and attentive, their expressions filled with pride. They weren't waiting for a celebrity or a dignitary flown in from abroad. They were waiting for the man who owned the very airline they worked for, a leader whose presence commanded respect without him ever demanding it. The man walked calmly down the jet bridge, his steps measured, his presence dignified. Flight attendants moved subtly around him, ensuring he was treated with the utmost courtesy, though he carried himself as though he were no different than any other traveler. Behind him, passengers followed in a mix of awe and admiration, still murmuring among themselves about how humbly he had carried his true status throughout the flight. Among those passengers was the woman who had mocked him. her earlier arrogance now replaced by a restless desperation. She clutched her bag tightly, her eyes darting between the gathered executives and the man walking ahead of her. She quickened her steps, hoping to slide into the circle of importance as though she belonged there. When the executives stepped forward to greet him with handshakes and respectful nods, she too tried to step forward, plastering a smile on her face, ready to act as though she were an old acquaintance. "There you are," she said brightly, her tone strained with forced familiarity. "I was just going to walk with you. We've shared quite the flight, haven't we?" But before she could close the gap, a pair of security personnel gently but firmly moved to block her path. Their tone was polite but unyielding as they told her she could not proceed further. The smile faltered on her face, her hand frozen mid-gesture. She tried to laugh it off, insisting that she had simply wanted to thank him, but the message was clear. This was not her place, and no amount of entitlement could buy her entry into his world. She stood there, watching him surrounded by respect, her own importance evaporating like mist in the morning sun. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. It wasn't just that she had stolen a seat or spoken rudely. It was that she had revealed herself. All the bragging, the insults, the entitlement. None of it could compare to the quiet dignity of the man who had endured her behavior without a word. Her so-called status was nothing more than noise, meaningless in the face of real success built on humility, intelligence, and leadership. The truth cut sharper than any scolding could have. As he prepared to step into the reception, awaiting him, the man paused briefly, turning just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes held no anger, no trace of mockery, only calm clarity. In a voice low but steady, he offered a single piece of wisdom that seemed to echo louder than all her boasts combined. People reveal who they are not by what they demand, but by how they treat others when they think no one is watching. With those words, he moved forward, leaving her standing frozen in silence, the lesson burning into her pride. She lowered her eyes, the sting of her own arrogance settling heavy in her chest. For the first time, she felt exposed not because of what others thought of her, but because of what she now realized about herself. As she walked away through the terminal, she did not strut or flaunt as before. Her steps were smaller, her shoulders lower. Passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal passed by her, their expressions a mix of judgment and pity. Some whispered the story already, voices filled with awe at the owner's composure and the lesson his silence had spoken louder than any confrontation. Long after, those who had been on that flight told the tale to friends and strangers alike. They spoke of a woman who tried to steal respect through entitlement, and of a man who showed that true authority never needs to boast. They reminded others never to judge a person's worth by appearance or skin color, for greatness often comes, clothed in humility, not arrogance. And as the man departed the terminal, escorted by his staff yet walking with the same calm stride he had carried onto the plane, he remained surrounded not by wealth flaunted or power declared, but by the quiet respect of all who now understood who he truly was. He needed no words of triumph, no dramatic gestures. His silence had spoken volumes, his grace had taught the lesson, and his strength had been recognized without him ever asking for it. In a world quick to judge by status or skin, this story reminds us that respect costs nothing but reveals everything.